An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislations by Jeremy Bentham. Let's begin by knowing who Jeremy Bentham is. Well, he is a jurist and political reformer, and is the philosopher whose name is the most closely associated with the foundational era of the modern utilitarian tradition. It was Bentham who rendered the theory in its recognizably secular and systematic form and made it a critical tool of moral and legal philosophy and political and social improvement. In an introduction to the principles of morals and legislations, as a preliminary to developing a theory of penal law, he detailed the basic elements of classical utilitarian theory. The historical context of the introduction to the principles of morals and legislations is that the worksheets were printed in 1780 with an original intent to serve as an introduction to the planned penal code. However, Bentham discusses what an introduction to a work on morality and legislation should contain. He suggests that it should cover matters common to every branch of the subject, or at least more than one branch. However, he believes his work falls short in this regard. He mentions that work lacks certain necessary analysis, such as those related to terms like emotion, passion, appetite, virtue, and vice. This analysis should have accompanied the discussion of terms like pleasure, pain, motive, and disposition. Bentham suggests that the order of topic covered should have been different. For example, the discussion related to punishment should have been preceded by discussions of civil matters exclusive to legislations. Additionally, he mentions the need for certain actions related to mental pathology would express the connection between the feelings of individuals and various incidents that result from government operations, especially in the creation and distribution of civil rights. Bentham believes that the discussion of offense and everything related to them should have come before the discussion of punishment, as the idea of punishment presupposes the idea of an offense. Bentham indicates that the discussion regarding the classification of offense would be better placed in a separate treatise focused on the form, method, and terminology of legislation. Bentham defends the inclusion of lengthy and detailed discussion, even though they might be dry and tedious to some readers. He argues that the practical use of this discussion in shaping laws justifying their inclusion. Here are the titles of the works that Jeremy Bentham plans to publish to fulfill his current objectives. He has listed them in the order that he believes make the most sense for understanding, as they will be ready to publish together. Part the first, Principles of Legislation in the Matter of Civil, more distinctly termed Private Distributive, or for shortness Distributive Law. This part of Bentham's work deals with the principles and concepts related to civil law, specifically private distributive law. Civil law governs the relationship between individuals, including property rights, contracts, and other legal matters related to personal and civil rights. Bentham aims to provide a foundational understanding of how laws and regulations should be structured in these civil or private matters. Part the second, Principle of Legislation in Matters of Penal Law. In this part, Bentham focuses on the principles and ideas related to penal law. Penal law deals with the offenses and punishment, including crimes, penalties, and legal systems approach to addressing unlawful behavior. Bentham explores the ethical and practical consideration involved in the creation and application of the penal laws. Part the third, Principles of Legislation in Matters of Procedure, uniting in one view the criminal and civil branches between which no line can be drawn but a very indistinct one, and that continually liable to variation. This part delves into the principles governing legal procedures. It emphasizes that the boundaries between criminal and civil law are not always clear-cut and can be subject to change. Legal procedure dictate how legal cases are conducted, including court processes, evidence presentation, and the rights and responsibilities of parties involved. Bentham claims to provide a comprehensive understanding of legal procedure that apply to both criminal and civil cases. Part the fourth, Principles of Legislation in Matters of Reward. The fourth part of Bentham's work addresses the principles related to the concept of rewards. While the previous part focused on areas such as civil law, criminal law, and legal procedures, this section explores the idea of providing incentives or rewards as a mean of motivating desirable behavior. Rewards can be used to encourage individuals to act in a certain ways, and Bentham examines the principles underlying this aspect of legislation. In this section, Jeremy Bentham's text, he discusses two contrasting principles, the principle of asceticism and the principle of sympathy and antipathy, while also emphasizing the importance of the principle of utility. Here's the breakdown of the key points. The principle of asceticism. Bentham starts by discussing the principle of asceticism, which is the idea that people should embrace pain or suffering and reject their personal lives. It hasn't been widely applied to government or governance, but even religious groups that practice asceticism typically do so voluntarily and don't aim to make others miserable. The next is inconsistency of asceticism. Bentham argues that the principle of asceticism is inconsistent and cannot be consistently pursued by any living creature. If even a small portion of the population were to adopt it consistently, it would lead to misery. Next is the principle of utility. Bentham contrasts the principle of asceticism with the principle of utility, which he believes can be consistently pursued. He argued that the more consistently the principle of utility is followed, the better it is for humanity. The principle of utility, in Bentham's view, promotes happiness and well-being. Do note that principle of utility, wherein the central idea of classical utilitarianism is the greatest happiness principle, or the principle of utility. It suggests that the right course of action is the one that maximizes overall happiness or pleasures and minimizes suffering or pain. In other words, actions are morally right if they lead to the greatest overall well-being for the greatest number of people. However, classical utilitarians believe that happiness and suffering could be quantified and measured. They propose a hedonistic calculus to determine the net pleasure or pain produced by a particular action. Factors like intensity, duration, certainty, and extent of pleasure or pain were considered in this calculus. Additionally, utilitarianism is consequentialist theory, meaning it focuses on the consequences of action rather than their intention. An action is judged as morally right or wrong based on the outcome it produces. Universality, also classical utilitarianism, is often presented as a universal ethical theory, meaning it applies to all individuals and situations. It does not discriminate based on physical or personal characteristic or circumstances. On the other hand, utilitarianism treats happiness or pleasure as a common measure that can be used to compare the moral value of different actions, and it seeks to maximize the common measure. To add sacrifice for the greater good, it's given emphasis on this principle because in some cases, utilitarianism may require individuals to make sacrifices for the greater good, even if those sacrifices affect their personal happiness or well-being. The moral value of an action is determined by its impact on the overall happiness of society. Next is the principle of sympathy, but before that, let's have a fun fact. Well, did you know that the Penal Code was to be the first in the collection of codes that would constitute the utilitarian panomion, a complete body of law based on the utility principle, the development of which was to engage Bentham in a lifetime's work and was to include civil, procedural, and constitutional law. Now the principles of sympathy and antipathy. Bentham introduces the principle that he believes is influential in the government and morality, the principle of sympathy and antipathy. This principle approves or disapproves of actions based on the personal feelings of approval or disapproval rather than any external consideration. Punishment is determined by the degree of disapproval associated with an action. Next is nature of the principle of sympathy and antipathy. Bentham argues that the principle of sympathy and antipathy is more of a negotiation of principle than a true guiding principle. It relies on the individual's internal sentiments of approval or disapproval without considering the external factors. Moving over to relying on personal feelings, supporters of the principle of sympathy and antipathy argues that the individual should condemn actions based on their personal feelings and the degree of hatred or disapproval in a person's feelings that determines the degree of punishment regardless of whether or not the action is adverse to utility. And then last but not least is the commonality of the principles. Bentham suggests that various ethical systems and standards of rights can be reduced to the principle of sympathy and antipathy. This system often avoid appealing to external standard and instead encourage people to accept the author's sentiment or opinion as reasons for moral judgment. We
Now let's talk about Kant's ethical theory, the good will. Now before we dive deep into its concepts, let's talk about Immanuel Kant. Now Immanuel Kant was born on April 22, 1724 in Königsberg, Prussia. In 1755, Kant returned to the University of Königsberg as a lecturer, and in 1770 he was appointed to a professorship in logic and metaphysics. Kant's family was of modest means, and his early life was marked by strict religious upbringing and a strong emphasis on education. Now let's focus on the last part of the list, which is Kant's strict religious upbringing. Kant's strict religious upbringing was mainly caused by his family's religious values, but despite that, Kant was never really a fan of religion, let alone God himself. Kant even thought that religion and morality are a terrible pairing, and if anything, the two should be kept apart. Instead, Kant argued that in order to determine what's right, you have to use reason and a sense of consideration for other people. Now, the two opposing theories that Kant is trying to deviate from are divine command theory and natural law theory. These two theories argue that what's good and what's not are determined by a God, and that morality comes from us but only because we are made by God. Now, Kant's version against these two is simply the good will. Now, the good will is just any rational will that is good. Now, this kind of definition might be very vague, but to classify what to consider as a good will, we must first ask ourselves what is moral. Now, moral by Kant is defined using these two formulations that he made, and the first one is the universality principle. It says here that act only in accordance with that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law without contradiction. So, as a uh, I mean, let's first talk about the maxim, and maxim means a rule or principle of action, while the universal law is something that must be done in similar situations. So, as a believer of Kantian ethical theory, before I act, I should ask myself what is the maxim of my action. In other words, what is the general rule that stands behind the particular action I'm considering. Now, here is an example of a situation in which Kant's theory is applied. Let's say that you are in a store where a clerk is sleeping. You're thinking of taking advantage of this sleeping clerk, and you steal your favorite chocolates and be on your merry way. Now, the action that you are considering is stealing, and if you approve the maxim of stealing, then what you're actually doing is universalizing that action. You're saying that everyone should always steal. If you should be able to do it, then everyone should be able to do it. The thing is, this leads to a contradiction. And remember, Kant's wording specifically says that moral actions cannot bring about contradiction. The, The contradiction here is that no one would say that everyone should steal all the time, because if everyone should always steal, then you should steal the chocolate, and then I should steal it back from you, and you should steal it back from me, and we are in an endless loop where no one could ever get to eat any chocolates. Therefore, stealing isn't universalizable. So what Kant uh, really is saying is that it's not fair to make exceptions for yourself. You don't really think stealing is okay, and by imagining what it would be like to universalize it, things would become chaotic. Now, moving on to the second formulation, it says here, act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a mere means. Now, let's unpack this phrase and understand what mere means. To use something as a mere means is to use it only for your own benefit with no thought to the interest or benefit of the thing that you are using. Now, we use things as a mere means all the time. I use my laptop to record this online lecture, and if it would stop benefiting me, like if it stopped working, I wouldn't use it anymore. Uh, it's perfectly fine to use things as mere means, but not humans. This is because we are what Kant called ends in ourselves. We are not mere objects that exist to be used by others. We are our own ends. We are rational and autonomous. We have the ability to set our goals and works towards them. As laptops exist for users' convenience, humans exist for themselves. So to treat someone as an end in itself means to recognize the humanity of the person you're encountering, to realize that it has goals, values, and interests of its own, and you must morally keep that in mind in your encounters with it. Now, Kant pointed out that we do use people all the time, and that's okay, because most of the time, we use other people as a means for something, but not as a mere means. We still recognize their humanity as we use them, and they agree to be used. So, for example, you are using me right now to get information about Kantian ethics. Unlike other things in the world, we are self-governed. We are able to set our own ends, to make our own free decisions based on our rational wills. We can set goals for ourselves and take steps to realize those goals. This imbues us with an absolute moral worth, which means that we shouldn't be manipulated or manipulate other agents for our own benefit. And this means that lying and deception are never okay. Because I'm being deceived, I can't make any autonomous decisions about how to act because my decision is based on false information. For instance, I might agree to let you borrow my razor so that you can shave, but your beard isn't shaved when you return the razor. So when you lie to me about what you're gonna do with the razor that you're asking for, you rob me of my ability to autonomously decide to help you. You've treated me as a mere means to accomplish your goals with no thought to my goals and interests. And that's a violation of Kant's second formulation. Kant argued that proper rational application of the categorical imperative will lead us to moral truth that is fixed and applicable to all moral agents. No God required. Now let's talk about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that determines right from wrong by focusing on outcomes. Actions should be measured in terms of happiness or pleasure that they produce. Utilitarianism holds that the most ethical choice is the one that will produce greatest good for the greatest number. It is called the principle of utility. Like Kant, utilitarians agree that a moral theory should apply equally to everyone, but they thought the way to do that was to ground it in something that's really intuitive, and there's really nothing more basic than the primal desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Now here's an example of a utilitarianism. Say that it's your turn to choose a movie for your weekly movie marathon with friends, and you want to choose Star Wars since You are a huge fan of the franchise, but you know that your friends don't like Star Wars and would pretty much prefer the Star Trek franchise. So during the movie marathon, you chose to watch Star Trek because you know most of you will be happy. Utilitarians, if this scenario is quite familiar to you, then congratulations. You are a utilitarian. You chose the action that would produce the most overall happiness for the group, even though it produced less happiness for you than other alternatives would have. Utilitarians suggest that we make our moral decisions from the position of a benevolent, disinterested spectator rather than thinking about what I should do. They suggest that I consider what I would think if I were advising a group of strangers about what they should do. That way, you'll have a disposition of goodwill, but you are not emotionally invested and you are just a spectator rather than a participant. Now, because of this, utilitarians came up with two types of utilitarianism. The first one is act utilitarian. In act utilitarian, in any given situation, you should choose the action that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, let's say that you are a doctor who has 5 patients who need transplants. One needs a heart, a lung, a pair of kidneys, and a liver. You also happen to have a neighbor. Who is lazy and is a good for nothing person. As utilitarians, the most ethical approach is to take the organs of your neighbor and give them to your patients. That way, we maximize the utility. Your patients will be saved and your good for nothing neighbor is gone. But there is one problem. Sacrificing your neighbor isn't probably a good thing to do, at least legally. Because of this, utilitarians came up with another type of utilitarianism, which is the rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism, we ought to live by the rules that in general are likely to lead the greatest good for the greatest number. Rule with Rule utilitarianism allows us to refrain from acts that might maximize utility in short run and instead follow rules that will maximize utility for the majority of the time. Now, so instead of sacrificing good for nothing people just to have organ transplants on certain individuals, rule utilitarianism dictates that we should also live by the rules, be it a state law or a spiritual one. This way, you don't really have to fear for your life being randomly chosen as a sacrifice for an organ transplant. Utilitarianism has its own limitations as well. Since we can't predict the future, it's difficult to know with certainty whether the consequences of our actions will be good or bad. If we go back to our previous example, there's a chance that killing a random person for an organ transplant would do more harm than good. This kind of possibility is what limits the capacity of utilitarianism, as it merely focuses on the factors at hand and the output that it generates for a short time. Now, before we end, here is a food for thought for you guys. If you have the ability to kill a killer and you don't, are you morally pure because you didn't kill, or are you morally dirty because you refuse to do what needs to be done?
With that last point, we end this presentation on the introduction to the principles of morals and legislations. If you have any more questions or clarifications, kindly contact me or Adriel. Thank you.